So I hope you noticed that we have a new addition to our campus today, a Black Lives Matter banner that is now flying proudly from our roof. Much thanks to the Social Justice Committee and the Board of Trustees for making it happen, for Carla Cody for ordering the banner, for Ray Wilson for risking life and limb to put it up, or hopefully not risking life and limb to put it up. It has been a long process, from putting a banner and yard signs out on the front of the property where they were promptly stolen, to taking a banner out into the community for vigils, and for now finally having a banner on the roof flying proudly in the neighborhood. In this, we join the company of many, many other UU churches which display a Black Lives Matter banner on their building or property. I thought I would show you just a few today. This is a UU Church of Hendricks County, right over in beautiful Danville, Indiana. This is the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. This is the UU Church of Boulder. This is UU in Rockville. This is Elliott Chapel in Missouri. And this is location unknown, but a reminder that these banners are subject to acts of vandalism. They sometimes draw negativity and hate. And we put them up anyway. This is Bull Run, Virginia. And since we put the banner up, I wanted to devote a little bit of time today to talk about what it means and where it comes from. The Black Lives Matter movement was started by three women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who described themselves as queer black women. And it started in response to the shooting death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. It began as a slogan that was put out on social media, hashtag Black Lives Matter, as a statement that is both a simple assertion of worth and dignity and a pained protest against a society and a system that has historically too often treated black lives as though they do not matter at all. The slogan sparked a movement, the movement for Black Lives, and countless local organizing efforts. The movement gained intensity after the shooting of Mike Brown, the events in Ferguson, the events in Baltimore. Today, there are many groups that exist loosely under the rubric of the movement for Black Lives. This is not a movement that was formed from the top down. This is a movement that has risen by local inspiration from the bottom up. So you really can't point at one particular thing or one voice and say, this is the movement. You can't point to one person or group and say, this is the voice of the movement. There are many voices in the movement, and they do not all agree on goals and methods, which is to be expected. You may have heard it said that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist movement. It is not. You may have heard it said that Black Lives Matter advocates violence towards police. They do not. Underneath it all is the simple assertion that Black Lives Matter. An assertion that, if it were fully realized, would transform American society in a fundamental way. Now, Unitarian Universalism, as an association of congregations, has consistently supported the language of Black Lives Matter and the broader goals of the movement. And we do this because this message is deeply resonant with our first principle, upholding the inherent worth and dignity of each person. And we find the goals consistent with our second and our sixth principles to create justice and equity and compassion between people and to work for a fair and peaceful world. And so to this end, various general assemblies of Unitarian Universalists over the last 20 years have called on our congregations both to deepen their own commitment to racial justice work and to honestly examine and address the ways that race plays out in our congregations and in our own lives as individuals. America was founded explicitly on a philosophy of white supremacy. That is our legacy, and that legacy plays out today in our institutions and in our culture. All of us who were born in America were raised in a culture of white supremacy. And so we all have to grapple personally and collectively with what that has meant and what that still means to us, because no one escaped that untouched in some way. So dealing with these issues, of course, means dealing with law and politics and economics and policy and all of those very vital things. But it is also a spiritual issue. It is a spiritual issue. So as a church, we are engaged with the spiritual work of dealing with our country's legacy of racism. What does it mean to live in a society where the worth and dignity of non-white people was denied for so long? What is the spiritual legacy of that history? Both for those whose dignity was denied and for those who have benefited, wittingly or unwittingly, from the denial, from those who were put in the position of favor. What is the spiritual state of a nation for whom the simple assertion, Black Lives Matter, is a revolutionary statement? I want to share a poem by the African-American poet Ross Gay, who wrote the poem Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude, which we've been reading from. It's called Pulled Over in Short Hills, New Jersey, 8 a.m. It's the shivering, when rage grows hot as an army of red ants and forces the mind to quiet the body. The quakes emerge, sometimes just the knees, but at worst through the hips, chest, neck, until, like a virus slipping inside the lungs and pulse, every ounce of strength tapped to squeeze words from my taut lips. His eyes scanning my car's insides, my eyes, my license, and as I answer the questions 3, 4, 5 times, my jaw tight as a vice, his hand massaging the gun butt, I imagine things I don't want to, and inside beg this to end before the shiver catches my hands and he sees and something happens. So what is a spiritual state of a nation where that is a regular experience for so many of its people, and an almost inconceivable experience for so many others who do not understand? Let's talk about language that comes from that gap in understanding. In response to the statement, Black Lives Matter, you often hear, isn't it the case that all lives matter? And for Unitarian Universalists, shouldn't that be our slogan? We are an inclusive people, that all lives matter. And the answer to that is yes, of course, absolutely, all lives matter. Absolutely, they do. And all lives should matter, but historically in America, and still today, all lives have not mattered. And this language, Black Lives Matter and all lives matter, it has a history and a context. In response to the extrajudicial killing of Trayvon Martin, of Michael Brown, of Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Rakia Boyd, Michael Crawford, Philando Castile, I could go on listing names all day of unarmed black people killed by police or vigilantes with no consequences and no regard for their life. In response to all of this state violence directed at black bodies and the violence of our drug war directed at black bodies, and the violence of environmental racism funneling industrial poisons into black communities and black bodies, and the violence of zero-tolerance school-to-prison pipelines that profit off of the mass incarceration of black bodies, and the violence of centuries of theft of black labor and black wealth. In response to all of this and the myriad of daily indignities and slights and insults offered up in this society, in response to all of this, black people assert in pain and outrage and pride, Black lives matter. And the response of some white people is to wordsmith their pain. Did you mean to say Black lives matter? I think you meant to say all lives matter. I fixed that for you. Doesn't that sound better? All lives matter. So the historical context is the phrase all lives matter doesn't exist except as a way of silencing the statement Black lives matter. Before Black Lives Matter, there was no movement of white people rallying under the banner cry, all lives matter, fighting the institutions of white supremacy. that betrayed that ideal. There were certainly white people doing anti-racism work, but there was no All Lives Matter movement. All Lives Matter is only ever said as a way of silencing or deflecting the statement, Black Lives Matter. And that is why we do not use that language. And this discomfort, honestly, with the phrase Black Lives Matter is in itself a reflection of the culture of white supremacy. Honestly, we white people, and I'm speaking here as a white person, we white people are used to things being about us. We are used to being the center of attention. We are used to things being for us. That is the natural state of things, to be about us and for us. But the statement Black Lives Matter is not about white people. It's not said for the benefit of white people. It is a statement that does not include us. Not because it excludes us, but just because it has nothing to do with us. It is about black people. Period. And again, speaking very broadly as a white person, not having things be about us is something that tends to freak our culture out a little bit. And it is something that we are going to have to get used to and get over. And this will involve spiritual work and spiritual growth. Being able to sit with the discomfort of having things not be about us and breathe and go, it's okay that this has nothing to do with me, and that is okay, and I support it anyway. Now, a different objection, and one which I do take seriously, is that Unitarian Universalists tend to be binary in our thinking about racial justice, framing things primarily in terms of black people and white people, and this is something that I have been guilty of as well. In part, this is because our association was formed at the height of the civil rights movement, and we did a lot of work in that regard, right? We were in the freedom movement. We marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and martyrs like James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo gave up their lives for that movement. So it is part of our identity to be in that movement. But of course, the functioning of white supremacy has not just impacted black people. It affects all people of color. And the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement would argue that anti-blackness is the historical linchpin of American racism from which all the rest radiates out. So to strike at the root of anti-blackness is to dig up the whole poison tree. Within Unitarian Universalism, we are called to affirm that Black Lives Matter and also recognize that racism takes many forms and impacts many different communities. And nowhere do we see that more heartbreakingly today than in the current controversy over the so-called Dreamers. The Dreamers are people whose parents brought them to America as very young children without documented status. This is the only home they have ever known. It is their home. It is their country. They had no say whatsoever in the decisions that led to them being brought here. In fact, many of these children grow up completely unaware of their undocumented status until, for example, they go to apply for a driver's license. DACA, or the Delayed Action for Childhood Arrivals, was a program that was set up by President Obama through executive action, executive order, to essentially formally deprioritize the deportation of these young people, of whom there are about 800,000 of them. 91% of them are employed. They are productive members of the community. They have families. They are mothers, fathers. If they are deported, they will be sent to a land they have never known, where they may not even know the language. They may have no family, no friends, no connections, no job. Most cruelly, their families will be broken up. Their children, who are American citizens, will either have to leave the country or lose their parents. Now, the question is often asked, if the Dreamers have been here for so long and they love America so much, why didn't they bother to become citizens? Why didn't they get on the path to citizenship and do this the right way? And there's a simple answer to that question. It is because that path does not exist. There is no path to citizenship for them to step onto. There is no way. And the reason that Obama set up the DACA program is precisely because Congress consistently failed, was unwilling, was unable to create that path for them. So he set DACA up to protect them. Now, people have argued, that was presidential overreach, that was an illegal executive action. People have said this is Congress's job and it should be done that way. And so this is at the root of President Trump's position of repealing DACA with 6 months for Congress to do its job. And his claim is that he wants the Dreamers' problem solved in the right way. But he chose to end DACA prior to having any legislation on the table that could fix the problem. And the Department of Homeland Security has already issued a memo telling these 800,000 people to use the next 6 months to get their affairs in order and prepare to be deported. I try to imagine being in their shoes and how I would live with that kind of uncertainty. I try to imagine what that fear must be like, facing the threat of being separated from my children and cast out into a foreign country. Regardless of what you think the correct policy is, the Dreamers' plight is utterly tragic. It is tragic. And it ought at the least to inspire sorrow or compassion or even pity. What is truly disheartening is the rage that so many of my fellow Americans seem to direct at these truly innocent people, and the glee with which they anticipate uprooting their lives and uprooting their families. And glee is not too strong a word. Of course, not all people who agree with Trump's policy can be characterized that way. I'm not saying that. But far too many can be. And the cruelty of how the Dreamers are being treated due to a situation over which they have no control is staggering to me. The nativist program that President Trump campaigned on and tends to reflexively return to has touched something very ugly in the American soul. So in the book of Esther, the story we told for Words for All Ages, we see the Jewish people living in a similar state of uncertainty as exiles in the Persian Empire, subject to the whims of a government and a society that profits off them but mistrusts them. And this evil courtier, motivated by his own financial gain and his own personal antagonisms, he whips up a campaign against them, and he gets the ear of the king, and the king sentences all of the Jews in the kingdom to be killed. The kids get the G-rated version, you get the R-rated version. He sentences them all to death. And deliverance comes from an unlikely source, a young woman, an orphan, someone far outside the locus of status and power in her society. And this is a theme in the Hebrew Bible, that it is often the words and deeds of the least likely person, the most humble, the most ordinary, that ultimately makes a difference, that frees the people, that saves the nation. Who am I to approach the king? Asks Esther. And Mordecai responds, perhaps you were made for just such a time as this. Well, the time we find ourselves in is one of rapid change, of uncertainty, and of conflict. Our nation seems to be more bitterly divided than I can recall in my lifetime, and that bitter division is feeding that poison tree of racism that lies at the heart of American history. So as UUs, where do we fit in with these times? We discussed last week that our religion is one of covenant and commitment, a religion that is first and foremost about how we live our values. And what are those values? The worth and dignity of each person, kindness and compassion, acceptance of one another, freedom, peace. Peace, not the old lying peace that papered over the suffering of the marginalized and the neglected. Not a peace that is merely the absence of conflict, born out of a desire not to make waves. The real peace that comes from bringing all people into community and caring for them. The peace of solidarity that says, I cannot be free until you are free, and let's get free together. These values are needed now more than ever. You were made for these times. You were made for these times. You don't have to march in the streets if marching in the streets is not your thing. You don't have to do politics if politics is not something that you do. You just have to find your voice and use it. And in the right place at the right time, trust that it will be enough, that it will be what is needed. You can be the quick and gentle flocking of the men to the old lady falling down. You can be the woman barefoot in the gaudy dress, stopping her car and whisking the turtle off the road. You can be the person who planted the walnut tree and would not bulldoze the ancient grove, but sailed his keys into the ocean. You can be the person who says, I will not fire, and turns back and turns away. There is love in your heart. Each person in this room, there's love in your heart. Trust that it is a love that the world has been waiting for. You were made for these times. Don't give in to cynicism and despair. And we were made for these times because we don't journey alone. We journey together as a people of faith, as a people of commitment. We journey together. We journey as a community that believes that fear and intolerance will never have the last word. We journey as a community that believes that the human spirit is meant to be free, and as a community who believes that the human spirit will be free. Don't give up. Don't give in. Find your voice. We were made for these times.